Hi, Elizabeth here, production assistant for the PodRocket podcast. Before we dive in, did you know that PodRocket is on YouTube? You can catch the full video versions of our episodes over on the LogRocket YouTube channel. Click the link in the description to tune in and subscribe so you never miss an episode.
I started on the web too old before React, and I was just like, this is insane to me that we can just accept that this is the only way. So I made benchmarks. I did tests. I looked at every example. I tried to see if I could build a system that was performant and ergonomic and had all the things that I liked. But more than that, actually having learned from stuff from React, like unidirectional flow, things that made apps more maintainable. You don't need React to hit these kind of problems when you're building apps.
Hello and welcome to PodRocket, a web development podcast brought to you by LogRocket. LogRocket provides AI-first session replay and analytics which surface the UX and technical issues impacting user experiences. Start understanding where your users are struggling by trying it free at logrocket.com. I'm Noel, and today we have Ryan Carniato, creator of SolidJS, here to talk about A Decade of SolidJS, a blog post he recently wrote. In this episode, Ryan and I talk about the history of Solid, the success on the heels of React hooks, and how signals may be the web primitive we all really need. So here's our episode with Ryan Carniato. Welcome back. Ryan, how's it going?
Hi. Glad to be back. It's definitely been a little while.
I think it's been a couple years. I don't remember exactly what the context was last time we chatted, but...
Probably Solid Start. It was probably like just before Solid Start came out around that.
Right.
So just about a year.
This blog post is an interesting one. It's kind of a reflection on your journey and Solid's path here and kind of your relationship with it and the framework community and open source in general and all this stuff. Why did you think now was a good time to push this out and get this out there?
Yeah, I don't know. To be fair, it hasn't quite been 10 years yet. It'll be 10 years like this summer. But it's been exactly 7 years from when I open sourced the library. That's what got me thinking about it. It's when some people started becoming aware of Solid, but I'd started working on Solid before that. 7 years still marks a long time. I remember it was actually on my birthday earlier in the year in February, and realizing that it had almost been 7 years since I open sourced it. And it was like my birthday was the day that the gap between when I first open sourced Solid till present day had finally exceeded the gap between when jQuery was released and React was released. Like, that's a long time in web development years.
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah.
Right? Because, people picture jQuery and then they picture React, and there's like a whole era in between. And this year, Solid's been around for that long.
It's always like an interesting exercise personally, but yeah, I hadn't done this in the web tooling framework world, because you're right, jQuery feels so much older than React in that way. Do you think that this kind of slowing of the tool landscape at large is a product of the ecosystem maturing, or do you think there's something with React that's caused this era to be a little bit more stable?
I think it's mostly a function of maturing, right? There was a lot of stuff back when I was getting into this and web development, and even getting into JavaScript. I spent some time on the back end after, like, in the early 2000s. When I got back into JavaScript around 2009, 2010, like, we had new libraries, new frameworks all the time. And even after React, the first few years, it was still very fast. I think just people naturally were looking for something they could trust. The thing is, as applications and requirements get more, I'm not going to say just complicated, but it's like the whole quality expectation goes up. You're going to want to expect more out of your tools, and you don't want to keep on shifting. It's just bigger projects, more at stake. It was kind of natural that things would slow down.
I don't find it super surprising either, but I do think it is interesting now, because I think that there was a point where we were churning through things very quickly. And then something happened. Now there are still several paths, but they seem to all be running in parallel. And there's still a big React community, there's a big Vue community, there's a big Svelte community, and there's a Solid community. Why do you think that these are all running with such steam behind them, when before it really felt like devs were more eager to jump ship and find a new thing to cling to?
Part of it is that desire for maturity. I think what part of it came in too is a lot more new web developers over time, and this continues to grow. And I think that we saw a whole generation of people on the web whose entry point was at a different place. Like When I started, we had HTML. No one used JavaScript maybe for something novel, but you had scripts and CGI bins and, like it was really rough. And you kind of expected to put things together. I think there's been a whole generation since declarative frameworks where people came out and React was that first introduction to the web. So even if you were going to pick a different solution, it's still going to resemble that somewhat. Like you're just like, that's kind of the expectation. And then, we went from that being like an app framework, right? React was built for apps, for highly interactive things, to people going, okay, well, this is the web. How do I build my static site? And they're just like, I know React. And this kind of universality continued onwards. And I think that's not why there's like camps per se, but that's part of that kind of slowdown and where there's not that as much expectation on exploration because the baseline, the ground floor, the abstraction had already been set. People aren't really peeking under the hood anymore. That's why I think we went from that phase where it was a lot of different frameworks and stuff all through 2009 through 2000, I want to say 14, 15.
14 was going to be my number too. Yeah.
Because React came out in 2013. It did take a year or two after React for the completely cement over. But to like, the focus of frameworks being on like different things. It's like instead of being like, oh, I do things this way or these novel things, a real DX focus kind of shifted. Like the only new frameworks coming out after 2015, for at least the next 3 or 4 years, it felt like were ones that focused on a different developer experience. We offer something different than React because we have templates or we have our HTML with our CSS or what. Like it was like very much a developer experience focus. Like the vibes you get off it, as Rich Harris will go later on to say. And I think that was because people didn't want to like think about something like too different. It was kind of like JavaScript fatigue came in where people were like tired of different libraries and stuff. By 2016, people were not interested in new frameworks anymore, really. Even though they continued to be built and a few of them were lucky enough to be successful, generally speaking, the maturing had started, this whole kind of shift had happened, and frameworks started targeting like the entry funnel. They started looking at like, how do I get adoption? How do I get people to like look at this and want to use it? That's already a much more mature place. It's not just a bunch of people with their technology, it's like marketing.
We hit an era where you could really market at the dev experience, right? And like target the developer to convince them. So this is as good of a foundation for our conversation as anything. So stepping into this like 7 and change years ago, what was your main motivation and what made you optimistic enough to get this out in front of the world and open source it when everybody was entrenched in React?
At first, I wasn't. It took me a long time. That's why I wrote like in this article, I'd been playing around with stuff like this 2015. For me, I actually had tried to build some stuff with other framework tools and use web components like back as far as like 13, 14. So I spent a lot of time doing web component open source stuff, like nothing really popular, but I made a few libraries and did some stuff with my company I was working at the time. But it was around 2015 when I realized that React had won. It was kind of obvious. And I was like, it wasn't about marketing or adoption kind of things for me. I was like, I don't like this. React is right. I had to like admit that there was a lot of mess in like Knockout, which was my favorite tool at the time. And no one was updating it anymore. Like it died out. And they were right. There was a lot of things that were unpredictable and magical, perhaps, which is hilarious by modern standards because everything is magical now by modern standards.
The level of magic we're okay with is much higher now than it was then. Yeah.
It was because for a while, I thought it was because people understood stuff more. I thought that we'd grown as a community and matured and understood our technology more and the magic was gone. And that's why we could go to higher levels of abstraction. But sometimes these days, I actually think it's just the expectation now is just that the magic is there and I don't need to understand it. For me, looking back at that time, I really was like, there's got to be another way. I remember I mentioned this in the article, but I watched some like performance benchmarks, especially one created by Ryan Florence. Many people know one of the co-creators of React Router and Remix. It was a performance demo around like a stock ticker. And I looked at this and I was like, no offense to Ryan, but I'm like, this is not a real app. It would be ludicrous to send like just tons and tons of data, like spam the page as fast as possible. And yeah, React was pretty good at that. But I'm like, there was a whole bunch of things that I didn't picture React being as good at potentially. There's no way that it was going to, if it's going to re-render everything. I know this is a very mechanical thing, but I'm like, there were other options out there before. And even libraries like that had some reactivity, like Vue, that were coming out at the time were like, yeah, we got a VDOM where we got, reactivity plus VDOM. And I'm just like, why VDOM? And I was like, I felt like I needed to do a sanity check. I guess I started on the web too old, before React, before the modern thing. And I was just like, this is insane to me that we can just accept that this is the only way. And yeah, so I made benchmarks. I did tests. I looked at every example. I tried to see if I could build a system that was performant and ergonomic and had all the things that I liked using Knockout without some of the bad sides, knock out the good parts. But more than that, actually having learned from stuff from React, like unidirectional flow, things that made apps more maintainable. I mean, you don't need React to hit these kind of problems when you're building apps. React was popular for introducing things like Flux, like better data patterns. But these best practices weren't, React's design helped support them, but they weren't always encoded into React. Like React did not ship a Flux module. It was just like best practices. React was always about best practices. And I'm like, why can't we have best practices that fit around other paradigms? They just have to be as well defined. React was really good at defining like its rules or its mindset. It let you come in and be like, look, think immutable, think, functional, think, this is how you want to approach the problem. Not everyone does when they approach React, but the creators at least had an idea and a direction, which is different than the frameworks before, because the frameworks before were just like, look, the DOM updates.
Yeah,
they didn't they were very mechanical. Any product evolution standpoint starts with some kind of technology, and then someone makes the Apple product, the iPhone, and they're like, look, you guys may have had a touchscreen before, but this is a touchscreen. React was kind of like that for front end. Immediately I was like, yeah, I get it, but that doesn't mean that's the only way to do it.
It feels like even in the early days, the way in which React was built, the way that it felt intuitive to interact with it, very much pushed developers into these patterns that I think made it easier to work on larger teams that were collaborating on larger projects versus going into every piece of your front end. Like, oh, someone worked on this component. The way in which they handle state management and everything was vastly different than some other part of the app. And I think React smoothed that over in a way that felt very nice.
Yeah, at least in theory. It's one of those interesting things because Angular also sought to solve that problem. And they did it where I was saying, look, we have a library for everything. You want to do this? Here's a service. You want to do this? Here's a service. React wasn't quite as prescriptive in that sense, but they did have at least a philosophy. They had a direction, and they're like, which is more than what a lot of solutions had at the time. It's kind of ironic now that when we step way further in the future, the fact that people did, React had to almost fashion, because like, even though it had guiding principles, best practices change. This is what helps things evolve. That now when people look at React, they call it a mess, but it was actually very freeing at the time to have limits. I know that's kind of weird, but to actually be like, look, this is like the rules. People wanted to be told what to do. As I said, it's very ironic that on one hand, React was like, this is how you do things. On the other hand, they were still flexible enough that best practices would continue to change over time. So it's a weird conflict, but on the other hand, I don't actually personally find it conflicting. That's like my favorite part about React. And it's the thing that I wanted to capture in Solid. That design philosophy really guided me in terms of focusing on primitives. Like for React, it's the components. But for me, it was like, okay, let's make this about the signals or the reactive system, and see how far we can take that. Because then we have these guidelines and we have these building blocks that we can actually continue to expand on top of in a predictable way.
That's well said. Angular always felt, I think it was so regimented. That was a lot of the pain that people felt working on those projects. And then React was like just unopinionated enough, or like it didn't really get in your way. I think it was also to your point of like new users ramping up. It was way easier. You didn't have to understand, like React, it was intuitive to look at. It was kind of dumb, but then it pointed one in the right direction. So there was like, yeah, some guidance, but it wasn't this like kind of whole new API that one had to understand to write in it. So yeah, it's interesting to think of those as a spectrum. You mentioned that this kind of like moving away, I guess, building with primitives, maybe it was kind of more something that we've been talking about here in a couple of instances, and that was a lot of your motivation. Was there like, why was this the thing that you felt was the missing piece? Like you mentioned the VDOM with Vue and like that kind of not really being the thing. Why was your big sell more like composability from the bottom up?
Yeah, Vue at the time actually had something called the Options API, which was these big objects. It's because everyone was scared of composition at this level. Everyone was like, our state should look like plain objects. Angular did it, in their case, in a fairly inefficient way, I should say. Like Zone.js, they just wait for every single event handler, async, anything that happened. And we're like, okay, did anything change after that? React did a little bit different where they had at least had like a set state where they're like, okay, this component owns the set state. When you call set state and you update something, we'll rerun the component, right? And Vue was like, okay, we'll just make these big getter. It's almost like a proxy, but we didn't have proxies back then. And the thing I loved about Knockout was that you just made these like little signal effect computer. You just like, I mean, to be fair, you could do this with Vue's objects, but they weren't quite as portable. Like when I used Knockout, like basically a component was a function. There was a whole other, it wasn't quite components like we know today because the Vue was like in a separate module. Like they used to call this MVVM or something. Vue. So it wasn't quite the same as a modern component, but effectively you started building up this kind of ephemeral state that was associated. There's the model that persists, and then there's the view that update and see in the templating. There was this real kind of like middle ground ephemeral state in the view model, which is like a component. It was like the early ground. The difference is it's a separate tree than the view tree where components mix view model and view together. But like it generally still had this kind of building of pieces. And we would just have a component as a function and then like its state be functions and then have functions call functions that wrap functions. Like it was just like you just compose it all up like a bunch of blocks, and then you'd be like, oh, I have this piece over here, I grab that and call it in here as a function. Composition was like, we always see this now as like a basic example, like use local storage or whatever, but that kind of hook like composition existed in the Knockout model because it was very similar idea. You'd be like, oh, I have they call them observables, but basically a signal. Be like, oh, I want to signal the rights to local storage, I'll just wrap that in a function and then create my own local storage signal. Like that kind of composableness had been in that model right from the beginning. And when I looked out at the JavaScript ecosystem, it was not there. So there was a DX thing that I wanted. And then on the other hand, conceptually, knowing that when I update this one thing, it updates this one other thing. There's no re-render, no diffing, none of that. It just all seemed like there's all these extra systems being built in that were all completely unnecessary. And as I said, I was kind of like, okay, maybe I just think this, maybe I'm crazy. But then when I started seeing conference talks where people talking like the performance of React, I was like, okay, no, this doesn't make, like, I need to vet it myself. And that's how I got involved. And I just wanted to recapture that developer experience. And honestly, I wasn't alone. There was a few other people working on very similar projects at that time. It just is funny because, as I said, there was a DX element, there was a UX element, but it wasn't like, how does this look? It wasn't like an aesthetic thing necessarily. It was a very mechanical driven thing. We wanted to make things more efficient and easier to use from that perspective. The truth is it wasn't a world that it seemed that people would be accepting of this because React had won, like even back then, everyone knew. And people just were like, yeah, I have my state that's plain objects. Very important because plain objects aren't magical. And then I have my templating or flavor I choose, and I just update it and it re-renders and I do the thing, like the whole VDOM spiel. Like that was where the world had gone to, and no one wanted these granular, composable state primitives.
I think the impulse towards that makes a lot of sense. And I think there's a reason it's been successful. It does away with a lot of that wiring up, which I think historically had been very gross. Like it'd been very hard to handle and it'd been very error prone. Like you'd always get all these weird front end bugs. Oh, I clicked the button and X didn't happen. And without something they're orchestrating it was always hard. But it sounds like your real thesis here is that like giving developers explicit control of those signals in a way that's easier for them to grasp and wrangle. Like that is really the place that you wanted to be. Would you say that's accurate?
Definitely. I was not a junior developer anymore. I did have a team, but I had a team on a startup that had been using Knockout. So we were familiar with the technology. We understood signals or whatever you want to call that type of reactivity, fine-grained reactivity at the time. And I wasn't worried about ramp up or who was going to learn it. I was like, have good technology to build good applications. It's isolated, it's modular. It gives you all these qualities that are really powerful when you want to build decent size apps. You don't have to worry about everything getting entangled. We were never debugging why components were re-rendering down 10 trees. There were places where you're like, oh, this thing updated more than I expected. But usually it was isolated and like within its certain zone, because when you're dealing with signals, you're dealing with a graph, a data graph. So dependencies talk to each other. It just made a lot of sense from all the mechanical reasons. It just wasn't nice to look at. And as I did more work on the benchmarks, it turned out I was like, no, this is actually really fast, like insanely fast. Like with a little bit of modern tooling, that's something Knockout never had. We aren't just like more performant than, say, React, which is a popular solution. Popular solutions generally are going to be like, they're not focusing on performance. They got users to worry about. We were like more performant than everything. Like I say we, but there's a couple independent projects at the time. There's myself, there's Adam Hale, he did Surplus. There's a couple other like these kind of signals based things. And this is what finally got me to open source it, because I was just like, I want to play in the benchmarks. I just want to like prove it, like from an academic almost standpoint. Just look, there is an alternative. I get it. It's not fashionable. I'm getting older now. Maybe I'm not fashionable. I don't care. Senior dev, I just do what I like. I mentioned this in the article. Things might have stayed that way if it weren't for the fact that React, less than a year later, was like, we finally solved composition. Here's hooks.
It sounds like you probably didn't see that really coming, this big kind of inflection point in React. So did that surprise you a lot? And I guess, were you expecting the amount of push into Solid that likely caused?
No, like I didn't see that coming at all. So the thing you have to understand is React's like functional roots and its whole like almost like a video game thinking of like immediate mode. I don't know if everyone knows the difference, but there's like classical and graphics, there's two different models. There's immediate mode and retained mode. Immediate mode, this idea that you can like re-render the whole scene graph every time. That's very common in video games because it keeps a constant frame rate. It's basically the thing that powers everything. They just recreate the graph every time and redraw the game. And it's great because it's predictable. You don't have to worry about weird artifacts happening over time. You just kind of slam it. There's a different model, the retained mode, where you actually keep something and you mutate it, where you just update only what needs to change. And this is understandably way more efficient, but it's less predictable because sometimes you change lots of things, sometimes you change a few things. Interestingly enough, the DOM is retained mode. Like it is some stays there, right? So like right off the bat, there's this mismatch between kind of like React mentality and like how the web platform works. So like I was like, if we align ourselves more with the platform, we can do better stuff. And where I'm going with this is you could just see this kind of two different mentalities, like the separation exists in the ecosystem in general. React was like the very first to come in and be like, maybe not the very first, but like the first popular enough to think immediate mode is good. We can just re-render everything. And this kind of mentality carried out into its ecosystem in terms of what succeeded. There were a couple people who were working on signals or like fine-grained reactive libraries in React. MobX, or Mobservable as was, is a signals implementation as state management for React. Obviously, it didn't always quite gel perfectly, but it was a very good solution, way ahead of its time. Great technology, big inspiration for what I did with signals later, but it never quite fit with like their mental model. Instead, the biggest competitor on the state management side at the time was Redux, which was you kind of like have this boilerplate. It was very simple in that like everything was functional driven and is all synchronous and there is no event emitter. There's just one store essentially. Redux became the poster child. I thought MobX was a way better solution, like way more powerful, way more capable, but Redux fit React's philosophy and re-render model. And in fact, the guys who created Redux became members of the React core team. It's funny, after the original creators of React kind of moved on to different projects, it was actually like the Redux maintainers became React. There's a passing of the torch here and that mentality preserved. So you have to understand React was never going to go this direction, which is why it completely shocked me when I saw hooks, because hooks are not the same. And if you ask them about it, they'll tell you something about some functional programming thing or whatnot and explaining, and they are mechanically different. With hooks, your component reruns and basically it checks the values and decides if the hooks rerun. Whereas like in the signals implementation, your components don't rerun, only the quote hooks rerun. So they are like opposites, but they look almost identical. Like there's no way you look at hooks and don't go, okay, these are like primitives. React's whole like previous, our state is just objects was out the window. This is clear. Use state, use memo, use callback, use effect, use whatever. And you can tell they got to it from a different place. If you look at their prior art when they released hooks, they don't mention signals, reactivity, anything like along that side. We were not influenced by that at all. But you look at it and you're like, come on, guys. To be fair, they probably weren't.
They arrived at the same destination, probably, like, in a way, right? There's this very similar feel to what these things are trying to do. Maybe by necessity, one could argue. But yeah, it's absolutely there. And it does feel like hooks is a roundabout way of reaching this destination. And I think that's part of the reason I still think that hooks are very tricky to grok, like what's actually going on with what the framework works for new developers. Even being a person that spent a lot of time in hooks, I find myself just throwing console logs at the top of a hook to like, wait, when is this actually firing? It feels very counterintuitive still.
It's interesting because in a lot of ways, like that was the argument they made against what they called key value observables, or essentially fine-grained reactivity. If you go watch a Pete Hunt talk or Tom Ochino or Jordan Walk, any of the original React guys, and when they're not talking about Angular, they're talking about basically Ember or Knockout. And when they're talking about what's wrong with that, there's like this great talk where Pete Hunt went to university, I think, or college, they call it in the US here, and basically gave a talk on like selling React. And it was a little bit more technical. And he broke into 3 ways where React was better than these other frameworks. And it was very specific about these kind of mechanical things in terms of what happens about like state ownership and knowing what reruns. And basically he broke it down. And I watched that video again about a year ago. And I was like pretending he was talking about modern React instead of Knockout. And the video fit perfectly. Like they basically, their whole positioning on this. If you ask them, they'll say they haven't, and it's still fine because of some academic, functional, whatever. But to be fair, as a layman developer looking at this and looking at, they're saying you could literally slot the hooks examples for the, say, Knockout examples, and you'd be like, yeah, I get what he's saying. And so it was a big departure. In some ways, it was necessary. It gave that composition. They needed something smaller than a component. React was all components, and they were like, okay, we actually need to compose something smaller than a component. How do we do this? And the way they solved it was basically saying, we'll make something that you can look smaller than a component, but it's still actually the component that's the level of granularity. It's still component based, but we're going to make something that looks smaller, right? Which is, I said, in contrast to like Signals, where the small thing is actually the unit of change. So I think both models make sense if you can get into them. It's just, I don't think either is actually simpler than the other anymore. I think early React, like class, lifecycle, render, was dirt simple. Everything since then, especially into hooks, they wandered into a territory that is similar to where these other solutions that they earlier condemned were. And for me, that was an opportunity. Only me, but for, I think, Evan Yu or Rich Harris as well. They announced hooks and people were excited about them. And I think people on the peripheral, on the outside, were like, wait a second, you guys made such a big fuss about plain data, re-rendering, blah, blah, blah. React has somehow set the fashion. People, I don't know what they're scared or they didn't believe, like I was pessimistic. And somehow they were like, no, it's okay to have these kind of data primitives. Within a week, Rich is talking about Svelte 3. That's where the compiler idea and using the $ hooks thing. Evan Yu's like, oh, we're going to pull out our stuff into the composition API. Fortunate for me, Solid already was there. Like it wasn't a shift. This is what I had been building.
The fact that there's this convergence, right? Like on this idea that we're talking around of like, eventually at some point for performance, the developer has to dictate when things change and how data should flow when it does. Like this, the kind of signal idea, and giving that back to developers, which I think hooks also encapsulates manually one way or another. Do you think that needs to be a more fundamental? Should that be a web primitive? Should the browser be doing that? That just seems like we've all arrived at this conclusion.
That's where it does seem like it is today, which is interesting in its own right. And browsers had proposals for different types of change management being built in for years. So I'm always very hesitant going to standards, trying to be careful there. But yes, it does seem like we are developing a language. And I do want to call it a language for reactivity. And this is not a language that I think we even invented. If you talk to somebody, I'm sure in the academic field, this language has existed for a while. We self-discovered it ourselves. But there is definitely a language. And I think for me, it was always important because I like control. As things scale up, I need escape hatches. I feel like it's necessary as senior dev to be able to not go too far into my abstractions. You want to decide how much you buy into stuff because at some point things will change. I think it's an even more interesting topic today because when we talk about designing a language for UI, you can't not think about AI and LLMs and all that kind of stuff. So that alone makes it almost inevitable because we might have built it because I wanted more control, but I think the machine, so to speak, wants more control as well. And giving them a primitive that's one step up is a lot more powerful for them. You can argue that something like React is simple because of these constraints and it just reruns and it makes it easier for things to understand it in a certain way. But it is not nearly as powerful. There's a difference between a lot of times with frameworks, you want to restrict power because you give too much to the users, then they'll do bad stuff. If we're going to a future where we're maybe not building things, maybe AI or something building things, then having power is actually really important because it will empower it to build better stuff. For me, it was always about empowering people because people like myself who knew what they're doing, people who wanted to get the best out of their tools. But it's definitely interesting. Sorry, I didn't mean to veer off into AI. There is a certain inevitability here, I think, that hopefully it's always like a back and forth, right? Like primitives are an abstraction. It's about finding the right boundaries. Initially, you might make a really crude abstraction and be like, this is pretty good and get you going. And then later you refine it. And when you refine it, you can get lower level. It's like the same process when frameworks build something and then eventually gets into the browser. You do something basic and kind of works. And then hopefully by the time it gets into standards, it's actually something that's well defined and maybe even simpler or smaller piece, like something that's actually more extensible, something more, adaptable.
I think adaptable is a great word. And I don't think it's too far off the rails here because I think you're right. I think it's hard for agents, whatever, LLMs or whatever is operating on these things to be operating at the level that the frameworks and the meta frameworks ask the user to operate at. It's so hard to have all of the context that a developer has, especially like someone that really understands the internals of the framework they're using. Like that's not what we've seen with the agents thus far. So I think that is an interesting notion. It does beg one to compare like a junior dev stepping into the space doesn't feel that different than an agent. It's like, okay, like they're just looking at what's exposed and lots of examples online and trying to do the thing as best they can. So there's an interesting discussion one could have there, but I don't want to send us too far down into the weeds here. So I guess, let's just like kind of real quick, and then I want to get to our little quick lightning round questions. But before we get there, do you think that in general, this notion of devs, you said kind of when we began talking that you were surprised at how much devs seem to be okay with the magic, right? Do you think that is maybe like what's causing this pain, or needing to understand the magic of hooks was kind of part of this problem? Or what is the thing that's driving devs to have this collective understanding that there is like, maybe I need to actually have control of my tools a little bit more?
Yeah, the problem is you can always add another abstraction, right? You can always make things easier and then easier and easier, but then you restrict it. And at a certain point, you have to break out of the abstraction, which means that my personal opinion is the bigger the gap is between the abstraction and the need of depth you need to get to the underlying system, the more complicated everything will feel. This is why React use effect is a problem. This is completely actually why it's the first time people realize how React works. And I think that as our tools get more complicated, generally the hope is that you don't need to peel the layers. Let's build a compiler on top of our framework to not have to worry about this. And then they need less and less and less, and like auto memorization and all. At a certain point, if that abstraction has no holes, then you're right. That will be easy and good to go. And maybe you won't need that knowledge. But I haven't found that to be the reality, which means that we are carrying this weight on us. And the only way to solve it is not to come up with another abstraction on top of the abstraction. It's to actually remove abstractions. Go, okay, now that we understand this problem better, how do we change the model? Yes, we need abstractions, we need primitives, but how has our understanding allowed us to actually change the foundations? And that is key, because that's at a certain point, that's the only way you simplify. You have to take stuff away. You can't just keep on adding.
Well said. Well said. I think it's probably as good a point to wrap as any. Let's do some quick fire questions and then we'll wrap properly. I think I have a hunch that some of the answers will be here, but we'll see if I'm right. What's a tech buzzword you wish would go away?
I don't know if I necessarily want to go away. The AI related stuff is just too much for me. Maybe I'm just not in the loop, but I think it's an exciting area in a certain sense. But for me, at least it doesn't impact me that much because I'm working on mechanical stuff. So it's this kind of thing that I just haven't I know it's funny to say, but it's just something that I don't spend that much time. It's only when I come on podcasts like here that I actually end up thinking about it all that much. So I don't know. I guess anything that's overhyped like that at the second, I guess specifically, I think vibe coding. I get it's good for prototyping, but at a certain point, engineers need to engineer.
Yeah, I'm yet to be convinced. I've seen like a couple little like very isolated examples of it happening, but I just can't. I'm yet to be convinced as well. On vibe coding specifically, I think AI stuff's there. I'm eager for the day when AI, like we aren't, it's not advertised. It's just like, okay, this thing uses AI, but as the user, you don't really need to know about it. It's just like how it's getting its thing done, but we'll see. That's neither here nor there. What's one idea you had about web dev in 2015 that you still believe today?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it almost this whole stream. It's the idea that like you do need to put control in, people's hands to a certain degree. You don't need to know how to build your tool from scratch, but you at least need to understand what the abstraction is. So I think it's important that things aren't too magical. I think at the base, you need to at least be able to have a good mental model of things. And that's what led me to build Solid. It was about transparency. It was like what you see is what you get. Yeah, that hasn't changed in the last 10 years.
Gotcha. Nice. What's the biggest myth about performance in front-end frameworks?
Oh man, I don't know if it's the biggest, but this one always bugs me enough because it's this idea that by adding a technology, say adding signals to something, suddenly it's faster. It's the same fallacy I was talking about earlier, but just more abstractions, adding more things, that makes it faster. The reason signals frameworks are fast is because they remove something. If you have signals and you make that your core and that's all it's doing, then that can be really performant. But if you say mix your signals with your virtual DOM, you're probably taking on the overhead of the virtual DOM and the overhead of signals. You're getting the worst of both worlds. Just taking your React and jamming signals into it won't make React faster. It'll probably make it slower, most definitely. And that's why when people ask the React team if they're going to move to signals, no, they have a very clear path. And that path is exclusive to this. Sure, you can use it for state management, but it's not going to improve React all of a sudden. There are architectural constraints. Not every feature is just something you can nail on and now it's better.
Can you think of a specific, like either project or type of project wherein this kind of fine-grained reactivity is necessary and like virtual DOM and like diffing like this just doesn't work?
Honestly, necessary? No. These technologies, I think there's benefits for ergonomics. I think there's benefits for performance, but no, if there's anything where it's like you need this, because the beautiful thing about the virtual DOM is it's like relatively good enough for most things. And the thing is, people were fine reloading web pages for a long time. I think that idea of what the need is a sliding scale and people's expectations will rise. There's places that obviously fine-grained really excels, which is places where you're doing lots of minuscule data updates, things like large tables or dashboards or stuff like that. It's not a matter of you can or can't. I guess another really cool example is people using it for video games.
Yeah,
It's
games.
like
that was going to be my point. Is just like really like up games with a ton of data flowing in and out.
Yeah, because one of the interesting things is we have a 3JS universal render port, like one of our custom renders in 3JS. It's like if you look at like the React solution, people actually have to opt out of the React state management. Like they use a whole different state library to actually do it performantly. You might still want to do that with Solid, but you don't have to. Like the signals are performant enough. You don't have to worry about like re-renders. So it is actually works quite well. So I think there are situations where it makes a lot of sense. I said there wasn't low memory devices are still a thing. We're very, very attractive on television devices. That's actually where some of our like bigger known things like Universal NBC, like Solid's used on television. And like we had some interest even from Netflix in that zone. It wasn't a plug and play swap from React. So it wasn't as easy to make that move. But like generally speaking, like there are places where it makes a lot of sense to have these qualities, but in a lot of places, like it will be good enough.
Yeah. Very cool. Yeah, the games example is going to be mine exactly. I got a couple side projects where I'm very much hitting this. Just I've got a ton of data flowing in and out that's like changing really quickly, and I'm feeling it a little bit as I'm like dragging stuff and moving stuff around. I'm like, this is React. I'm fighting React here in a way I don't want to be. So I'm glad you called that one out. This is kind of a question more about you. What do you think is the hardest part of maintaining an open source project that most people aren't cognizant of?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's just there's a lot day to day. People will come in and they'll see their issue or their thing that they care about. And the truth is, when you're open source, your work is always in public. There are so many different people you're catering to, and you're directly talking to the public. There's no insulation in the way. Like I worked on product teams in companies, and there's customer success team or whatever. Like open source, your customer are the developers and you're interacting with them directly. So I don't know if this is like a hidden thing, but it's just, there is like a huge amount of just bookkeeping, in the sense of not like money or anything, like just people and capabilities and projects. And people generally only come in for their narrow slice, so they don't see the breadth of it all. I mean, it's hard to keep on track of it when you also want to build stuff or you want to try new ideas and whatnot. I guess there's been more visibility on this recently, where you see open source maintainers respond back to rude people or whatever. But it's just, there's those people on one extreme, but there's everything in between. It's just, these projects end up small, but they become massive. And it often without the infrastructure that you would find at like a funded company, that can make things difficult.
Yeah, there's probably not a lot of open source product managers that are just like, okay, I'll do all of the product triaging and everything, and then I hand it off to the developers. What's one thing fine-grained reactivity can do that the virtual DOM just can't?
Yeah, it's funny. Normally, I wouldn't say like any technology can or can't do anything, because you can always work around it and find the escape, like find ways to like make it work. So it's in your project, I'm sure there's a way you can make it do what you want. But there are benefits that people are only starting to realize right now, especially seeing fine-grained rendering coming into stuff like Svelte 5 or Vue Vapor. And you can start seeing this community start thinking about like how we approach things differently. And I think the thing that people don't understand is, by writing your code this way, you are giving your application knowledge of how data flows through your app. And this is incredibly powerful, because it does mean you can do things that just don't make sense or don't work in the virtual DOM. Like, for example, you can fetch some data somewhere in your app, and if that data errors out somewhere deep where it's being used, like say rendering, and you like hit an error boundary or something, if you retry the error boundary in a typical virtual DOM library, like, I think this is why React doesn't have an error boundary component. It doesn't know what to do. You have to fix the error so that the next time it re-renders or whatever, it knows that it will be corrected. Otherwise, it's just going to error again. But like with a fine-grained system, because you know the data dependencies, you can be like, oh, let me retry what errored, and trace the data graph all the way up to the data fetching, and be like, I'm just going to refetch what failed. And this kind of power is incredible, right? So like you can picture you have some data fetching, and then as I said, lower down, you're like try to render something with that data and it fails. And then you're just like, oh, I'm going to retry. Maybe the user has a button they can click. It can self-heal. And this is because the program understands the graph. And this capability, people are only starting to realize it's now getting built into applications because of SolidJS or Vue Vapor. It's felt like when you start writing your code this way, you'll be unlocking other capabilities like this. We've seen advantages to this, like in debugging. You can actually be like, oh, visualize the graph. And I'm looking forward to these kind of things working their way more into developer tools, especially like IDE support and stuff, because you can use the data dependency graph to know like when you edit code, what part of your application could be impacted.
Yeah. What needs to reload, like what tests need to run, all that stuff.
Yes.
That could be very cool.
So for me, that is some huge benefit to using fine-grained reactivity that you don't really get with the virtual DOM.
Nice. I feel like that's as good a note to end on as any. Yeah, thank you for pulling that question out of me. And thank you for coming online and chatting with me, Ryan. It's been a pleasure, as always. And I'm looking forward to next time.
Yeah, no, it was a lot of fun. And I always have a lot of fun. This podcast is definitely one of my favorites. So you guys, or I have something new to share, I will be back.